Good evening, dear teachers and colleagues. The topic of my presentation today is a patient of coronary artery disease with severe LV systolic dysfunction, the decision-making paradigm. Patient was a 52 years old male, a diabetic, type 2 diabetic, with a recent history of COVID-19 infection few months ago, and a recent history of acute coronary syndrome few days back. Patient underwent coronary angiography outside, which revealed critical single vessel disease in the LAD or left anterior descending coronary artery. Patient got admitted to us with increasing breathlessness and fatigue on 18th of July this year. And patient was earlier admitted at other institute and where underwent coronary angiography 3 days admission to us. That is on 15th of July. And patient had infection of COVID in May infection. That was a mild COVID infection, not a pneumonitis. And diabetes was recently diagnosed and most probably post-COVID. On examination, when patient presented to us, BP was 130/90, pulse rate was about 64 per minute regular, respiratory rate was 20 to 22, saturation at room air was 93%. In the chest, there were a few bilateral there was LVS3, suggestive of active left ventricular failure, and per abdominal CNS were within normal limits or unremarkable. Then yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So then the blood investigations, to of our surprise, almost all things were in normal limits like hemoglobin, TLC, serum sodium, potassium, but serum creatinine and blood urea were quite out of range. That is, it was 4.5 creatinine. And when we tested the creatinine at the time of angiography, just few days back, it was 1.6 and urea was 26. So basically, the diagnosis was patient was having contrast-induced nephropathy or acute kidney injury. Also, patient was on ACE inhibitors and mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, which are the usual treatment in LV dysfunction. But when patient landed to us with high serum creatinine. This was an ECG in which there is the QRS is broad and nearly an LVV type of picture with a PR interval of 160 millisecond and a heart rate of 56 per minute. So the remarkable thing was, important thing was a broad QRS complex. Suggestive of yeah.
So Amit, at this stage, let's discuss the clinical presentation of this patient. So this patient presented at quite late at night with a feeling of very uneasiness, recurrent vomitings, and unable to lie down in bed. So once we have such a patient, you have found that there is S3 gallop, but 2-3 things. One is there's no significant tachycardia if we are looking at LVF. The heart rate you have recorded 64, even this ECG showing less than 60. And so this probably you think could be a drug effect, or why do you think this patient didn't have, or could it be hyperkalemia? And the other thing is that the recurrent vomiting again gave us a clue that this patient who has undergone angiography a few days back is coming with recurrent vomiting and has been exposed, he's a diabetic patient. He's been exposed to various drugs such as ACE inhibitors or MRAs. So in these patients, the clinical suspicion of contrast-induced nephropathy is very high. This contrast-induced nephropathy is a problem that radiologists also face, cardiologists also face. We most of all, because we are injecting contrast intra-arterially and usually in large volumes. And the issue with CIN is that the manifestations start from about 48 hours later rather than in the first 24 hours, and then the creatinine might keep on rising till the next 7 to 10 days. There are various risk factors for contrast nephropathy, including dehydration, including a baseline abnormal renal function. And does this patient has some background kidney history, isn't it?
Yes, yes. A patient had kidney stone history with history of PCNL informed intervention about 5 years ago.
Right.
So this was
And
a-
we know that he's recently diagnosed diabetic. His creatinine was 1.6. So he becomes a high risk candidate for contrast nephropathy. And I think the advice should have been that he should have been followed up at the original institute with a repeat creatinine and potassium, especially with these factors. And if he was being put on treatment for heart failure with the drugs that we've already mentioned. Will you agree?
ACE inhibitors, then the mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, and then overzealous use of even loop diuretics, metolazone can also lead to rising urea and creatinine levels.
So this patient had all the risk factors, and then we, or rather the clinicians worsened his risk of having CN by putting him on all these drugs in view of severe LV dysfunction, by putting him on loop diuretics, by putting him on ACE inhibitors and MRAs. So I think this is a very, very important lesson. And we know that CIN is not an innocent or an innocuous clinical condition. It has a poor prognosis, even in the medium and long term. Patients who develop chronic contrast-induced nephropathy have higher mortality rates than patients who do not. So I think that is a very important lesson for us to understand in this patient, and make sure that we prevent the development of AKI. So now in this patient, we are presented with a clinical problem of severe LV dysfunction. Patient is in incipient LVF, and he is gone into acute kidney shutdown. So fortunately for us, the patient was not oliguric, and so we had to postpone the cardiac management initially so that we could manage the kidney issues and come out of it. So this is, would you like to talk about the echo? And then I'm glad we got my co-moderator, that is Dr. Hemant Madan, with us. Hemant, are you up to speed with the case so far? All right, we'll catch him a bit later. Will please describe and show us the echo.
Yeah. So the 2D echocardiography was done, which was history of akinetic mid-anterior septum, mid-interventricular septum, apex, mid-anterior wall, and with rest of the segments being hypokinetic. The left ventricle was, a bit dilated, but mostly at upper range of normal rather than full dilation. And both interventricular septum and posterior wall thickness was 1 centimeter, which is important because it was preserved. So that is maybe an indicative of better outcome. And though LVEF was only 25%. So the issues of interest in our case were a lot. Like the patient was having a critical single vessel disease, though the simple fantasy looks that we can open up the artery whenever there is single vessel disease. But the important points in our case were severe coincident LV systolic dysfunction, then the myocardial viability was in a question, then the acute kidney injury or the contrast-induced nephropathy. So these all challenges were there in the case.
So yeah, these are the echo loops.
Yeah, we can see most of the area being hypo to akinetic, the LV artery, and the left ventricle was at sort of upper limit of normal rather than a total dilation. And if we observe carefully, the thickness of the septum and the posterior wall was relatively preserved, not that much thinned out or scarred out. These are various views, apical 4-chamber view.
So this is showing severe hypokinesia of the anterior wall, as well as almost akinetic septum, a dilated LV, and an EF of around 20 to 25%. So let's stop at this stage, and let's just invite any discussion points. Dr. Madan is here. Any inputs? Hemant, would you like to give us any inputs regarding this clinical situation that we are in? And let us know what your thoughts are and how, what do you think we should proceed with this case. And Everyone else is welcome to come in and ask any questions or put any queries or make any comments. Please go ahead. Hemant.
Well, I missed the first part of the discussion, sir. So, I'm not sure the predicament that we are in.
So this patient had COVID-19 in May and was diagnosed to be diabetic around that time. At another hospital, he underwent an angiogram because they found severe LV dysfunction. He was found to have critical single vessel disease. And he was advised to do some viability studies before undergoing any revascularization. 3 days later, he presented to us with features of LVF and recurring vomiting. We found he had features of LV dysfunction on echo, and his creatinine was 4.5 with a baseline creatinine earlier, which we found was 1.6. So these were the things, and his ECG and the echo we showed.
So, if I was to take it head on as a cardiologist, from a cardiologist perspective, the only two issues would be: one, whether we should intervene or not, and two, at what stage should we intervene, and what are the pre-intervention precautions and modalities that we should take for this patient.
Okay. So clearly, with this severe LV dysfunction, the risk of intervening becomes significantly higher than in a person with normal coronary, normal LV function. And so we need to understand or balance the risk of intervention versus the benefit. And that's why we need to look at whether what we are going to do is going to benefit the patient. And so viability studies of the myocardium become very, very important. That gives us a predictive, some sort of prediction that this patient will improve with our intervention.
Absolutely, very, very, very true. But short of viability studies, there are some clinical indicators and some echocardiographic indicators which suggest that this territory may be viable. Clinically, if a patient has angina, it's a very strong indicator that this is probably a viable myocardium. ECG wise, if there are preserved R waves in that segment, if LV shows an ejection fraction of 20%, but you find low voltage or even normal voltage R waves in anterior leads, that it's probably a preserved myocardium. Echocardiographically, preserved LV thickness certainly indicates that this may be a viable territory. Additionally, if it's a ostial or a proximal LAD lesion, even if the LAD territory looks completely akinetic, looks unviable, I would perhaps still consider revascularization because of some diagonal flow advantage and some lateral wall advantage that it may give us. Regarding the timing of intervention, I'm a great supporter of admitting patients for 2-3 days prior to intervention in such 6 subsets. Maintain adequate, get adequate diuresis through, get adequate filling pressures, give them strict bed rest, and thereafter take them up for intervention. I have a feeling that they do better with this strategy rather than the routine angioplasty strategy where you admit them in the morning and do an angioplasty in the afternoon, which is kind of a hurried affair generally.
Right. So very good points, Hemant, that you brought out, that to look for myocardial viability and is very important, and the clues that you pointed out are extremely valuable. That these can be the clinical clues and the clues on your basic set of investigations can give us an idea. And yes, if the vessel is something like an LAD which subtends the largest portion of the myocardium, then a very proximal lesion, although the risk is severe, but you might consider revascularizing these patients with those kind of lesions so that you get some kind of benefit for it. But again, it all depends on how the patient is behaving. If the patient has got extremely poor LV function, then intervening becomes a high risk affair, and then you need. Anjali, can you mute? Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir, I'll do.
Anyone else, please? Anjali, please mute. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. So, and in this patient, now we have the additional problem of contrast-induced nephropathy and AKI. And this becomes a challenge in patients with severe LV dysfunction also, or that how to manage these patients. So over to Amit now, who will tell us that how we proceeded to go about dealing with this. Would anyone else like to make any comments or raise any other issues or any other discussion points or any clarification points? This is the time. Please go ahead. Right. So go ahead, Amit.
So AKI or CAN was managed initially. The offending drugs were withdrawn, like ACE inhibitors, MRAs, and those quite high dose of diuretics. And we gave guarded IV fluids at around 25 to 30 ml per hour with daily testing of renal function test. And we were lucky that serum creatinine improved from 4.5 to nearly baseline of 1.6 in about 2.5 to 3 days. And the urea improved from 88 to 26. So now the other important aspect was the myocardial viability. So we were thinking of whether to choose those sensitive tests of perfusion techniques of thallium or PET scan, or to choose the more specific one, but with a bit of low sensitivity, that is a pharmacological stress echo or dobutamine echo. So we opted for low dose dobutamine stress echo for evaluating the viability in this patient.
So what were the challenges in this patient for us to undergo, more sensitive tests like an MRI or a nuclear scan like a PET scan? Why did we not offer these?
So because of those skeptical behaving kidneys or the renal functions, we thought of a less invasive and easily available test and easy which can give us idea
So
of
in
the
both
viability.
in PET CT also we'll have to give a large volume of contrast, and even in cardiac MRI for viability, we would have to administer gadolinium, both of which are nephrotoxic. So it became quite challenging to take up this, and we thought of doing a dobutamine stress echo, which you can tell us what the result of the DSC was.
Yeah, so it was basically a low dose dobutamine stress echo, because initially we start at 5, but in low dose it is particularly mentioned that initial dose should be 2.5, because as I say that low dose of iron drops, if we can see an increase in the contractility of the left ventricle, it is a indicative of increased myocardial viability. The LVF improvement was seen from 25 to 30, although just a 5% improvement, but even this much was sufficient to give a hint that the myocardium was viable, and at low dose. And at a higher dose of 20 max per kg per minute, again it became more of hypo to akinetic, what is called as classical biphasic response, and it was suggestive of a hibernating or a viable myocardium. Low dose DSC.
Based upon this viability assessment and the fact that there was a very critical LAD lesion, so we went ahead and did the angioplasty of this patient, and that could be done quite successfully and without much of fuss. And I think we had a good result. So let's just skip to those angiographic slides. Yeah, you can talk about these slides to show these.
Yeah, this is angiogram at our side, nearly 99% occlusion of the proximal to mid-LAT segment. Again, a different view of the same thing.
अच्छा सर, कहाँ पे सर?
Yeah, this is the start of the intervention, where we can see the wire and the pre-dilation or the ballooning of the segment. And this is the result after stenting, we put a long 2.5 into 48 mm stent from proximal to mid LAD with a TB3 flow.
I used to stay just besides DAV College at that point of time.
So
I would have been Karanpur.
the angioplasty was finished.
So I was born and brought up in Karanpur.
Much problem.
So would you like to conclude the case then?
Yeah, so the important issues in our case were to identify few things such as renal
That's a
function,
bit happening
very
case.
important
Yes,
in
yes,
our
yes.
case, then the offending drugs identification, then the LVF management, then contrast-induced nephropathy, and last but not the least, myocardial viability, whether intervention to the patient or not, that too a safe option, in which in our case was dobutamine stress echo. And we were lucky that renal dysfunction also got improved, and also the myocardium was viable, and we could finish off the angioplasty also with a good end result. So these all were the take-home points.
Right. Okay, so just to sum up, that in this case we used the various challenges that we in this case that we had of severe LV dysfunction and contrast nephropathy. So how we went about it, and we could achieve a successful revascularization. Coincidentally, this patient visited me today in the OPD. This is about 2 weeks later. We got a screening echo done. He's feeling better. He's able to move around and walk around. And now he says that you must make me well, because he's a trader in apples. So he wants to start work again. And his echo is showing an improvement about 30 to 35%. Only 2 weeks. So hopefully he should have further improvement. And with this approach, we hope that his LV should improve significantly. So that was the case. Now we will hand over the session to Dr. Vivek. So Dr. Vivek, please come.
आपने टेक्नोलॉजी का बनाया हुआ क्या डब्बा मिलकर टेक्नोलॉजी
Actually, क्या है वो pen drive हो जाती हैं.
So please say hello to Dr. Vivek, and please introduce yourself, Dr. Vivek. And over to you. Anjali, please try to mute everyone so that we don't have any disturbance. Many thanks. Many thanks to all of us. Yes.
Charges का अलग है.
Thank you for a wonderful insight into the case.
मेरे मन में start है.
This side now, Dr. Vivek, I'm consultant radiologist, and we'd like to go through the cardiac MRI part, and we'll try to answer some of the queries which the case had raised, and how cardiac MRI could be of help. And an overview about cardiac MRI for myocardial imaging.
Okay, this is your. Sorry.
So yes, so today's talk will be focused around imaging for myocardial viability, and we would like to answer the queries raised in this particular scenario as well, whether the imaging would able to assess the scar burden and thus prognosticate whether a revascularization, whether stenting or a CAB would be help in such cases. So yeah, before we move ahead, I want everybody should be on the same page. So here we have this image. In this, the blue arrow is showing this bright white line in the subendocardial region, which suggests there is area of myocardial infarction, and it is involving less than 50%, so like close to 25% of the total thickness of the myocardium.
Vivek, for ignorant people like me, the black portion is the myocardium.
It's a normal myocardium,
right,
as you can see at the rest of the places. And the white portion is the scar tissue. And the total thickness of the scar also we are able to see. And in contrast to that, the other half of the film marked by the yellow arrow here is denoting there is a full thickness involvement of there's a transmural myocardial infarction in this particular segment. Okay, now we move ahead. And just an overview. So there is myocardial ischemia. This may progress into myocardial necrosis if it is severe and prolonged. And if there is timely reperfusion, then it will land up as stunned myocardium, and which will show recovery in days to weeks period. But if we have a chronically low flow, then the flow is then there will land up into a hibernating myocardium. So if you do revascularize this segment, then in weeks to months time, we can again get back this to normal functioning part. So the main aim is to differentiate between hibernating myocardium versus myocardial scarring. So some may also put it up as between difference between viable myocardium versus non-viable. So both are the same things. So in this we have low dose butamine as sir suggested. So the whole technique is similar, but it's just after this dobutamine injection, instead of normal echo, we will be putting him in the MRI. So this will help us to differentiate whether we are dealing with a hibernating myocardium or we are having a scar tissue. So the hibernating myocardium, as the inotrope is administered, so will the akinetic or hypokinetic will start to show contractility. So that's the basis behind it. And besides this, they will also be able to characterize how much is the scar length, how much is what all segments are involved with it, and also if the LV wall thickness, as sir already mentioned, if it is more than 5 to 6 mm, then we have substantial amount of myocardium remaining, and it is unlikely to be a transmural infarction. So the patient will be benefited. And there are several ways to assess indirectly as well as directly about the myocardial viability. Indirect, we have already talked about the wall motion abnormalities, echo and other ECG abnormalities, and direct assessment, although myocyte integrity would be the most precise, but definitely one of the least feasible, because nobody is going to do a cardiac biopsy to assess whether myocardial scarring is there or not. So we have another modality, so cardiac MRI. Now, why the scar quantification is important? So before going into the details how it is done and what it prognosticates, so the scar quantification is an independent predictor of long-term survival in patients with ischemic heart disease, whether we are treating them with bypass graft or stent grafting. So it has a direct acts as a direct predictor. So how we go about it? So we do left ventricle scar scoring. It's a very pretty simple. So we have, just as in AHA segments, apex is not there. So we have 16 segments, and we give each segment a score of 1. So 1 score stands when there is no scar, and if the scar is less than 50%, score will be 2. Then if the scar thickness is more than 50% or transmural, that segment will be assigned a score of 3. Then we add up all the segments and divide by 16, so to have that score. So before moving forward, so just going back to the previous image, so if we are talking about this particular segment here, so this will be assigned a score of 2 since it is less than 50% involvement. And if we are talking, say, about in the same image, if we are talking about the normal reference segment, so this will be assigned a score of 1. And on the yellow part of the image, so this is a transmural infarct. So this particular segments will be given score of 3. So we add up and divide by the 16. So how and further, if that score comes, so if all the segments we presume don't have any scar tissue, so all the segments will be assigned 1 at least, because no scar, you will be giving 1. And for 16 segments, so 16, it has to be divided by 16, so we'll end up as 1 total. So if we have a score of 1, so that means there is no scar. Now, if the score is between 1 to 1.24, so we have a mild scar burden. And if it is between 1.2 to 1.4, it will be moderate. And if it is greater than 1.4, so we are dealing with a higher scar burden. So higher scar burden eventually will have a poorer prognosis. So another way of doing it is of scoring is it's a bit simpler. So in this we are looking at how many segments are involved. So if whether it is segments, it is less than equal to 4 are involved, then we still label it as low scar burden. Okay, so this we have already talked about. Then what are coming to the implications of scoring? So segments with greater than 50% scar have a low probability of functional recovery, and with less than 50% transmural scar are predicted to have a better functional recovery. And presence of less than scar segments will have better recovery. We have already discussed. Now getting to the one example of this case, this patient had a dual vessel disease involving LAD and LCX, and we performed myocardial imaging at our institute. So this first image is a T2 fat set image. So in this, what we are looking at, we are looking again at this subendocardial region, which is appearing bright to the bright or white in contrast compared to the rest of the myocardium. So so now, so in this case, we have not administered contrast. So we have this area of altered signal intensity appearing as bright. So what differential we put forward at this place is one, this could be acute infarct. And why I said acute, because after this I'll be doing late gadolinium enhancement, which is the hallmark in detecting whether myocardial scarring is present or not. So late gadolinium enhancement will show enhancement in both acute as well as chronic myocardial scarring. But if this particular sequence will help us to differentiate whether the infarct is acute or not. If the infarct is acute, we'll still have hyperintensity. This we can in a
Vivek, let me ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
Compared to stroke,
Right.
where you can immediately diagnose a stroke or not based upon your particular sequences that you run. Which is that particular sequence that you run that gives you an immediate for acute stroke?
So that is to assess the scar tissue. We have late gadolinium enhancement.
No, for a stroke, for CVA.
For
CVA.
Okay, are we talking about brain?
Diffusion weighted, no, DW.
Right.
DW scan, you get an acute stroke, isn't it?
Right.
So for a cardiac, for an acute MI, how soon can you diagnose an acute MI on cardiac? Can we use this as a rule in or rule out?
Yes, sir. It can be done like it is a very sensitive sequence. So it will pick up any inflammation, any edema. It is as early as like you can immediately take up.
So do you think that like in stroke, we might foresee doing cardiac MRI to assess whether the patient's pain chest is actually from an MI or not? Could it be a possibility?
Yeah, but sir, because MR is a bit time taking, and first we go into the stabilizing patient part.
That is separate. But I'm asking that from a technology point of view.
Yeah. So as soon as patient has angina and we take up for a MR and this particular sequence, we can highlight which particular part seems to be involved.
Okay.
And whether.
So I don't think we were aware that we can use this for an acute MI diagnosis.
Yeah, so one second statement would be whether this part is totally viable or not, or non-viable, for that we have to administer.
No, that is different. When we are looking at a patient coming with chest pain, our plan is to rule in or rule out. Maybe sometimes you're not so clear with the other modalities. So this is also a modality.
So sometimes in the case of NSTEMI, if we find an interstitial lesion in 2 arteries, this cardiac MRI again has a rule. If we find a fresh infarction, that means that is a culprit artery in NSTEMI.
So subsequently, the late gadolinium enhancement was appreciated in this region. So almost we can appreciate this white scar tissue, which is almost involving 50% of the wall thickness in this region. So and this area, let's go back to the image. That this area almost corresponds in length with the and size of the altered signal, which we had seen on the T2 fat set images. So there is no mismatch between the size of the edema part or the initial part which we had seen and on the scarred tissue, which is highlighted by the late gadolinium. So we would say the whatever portion which we had seen earlier is totally.
Can we
functional.
also localize which vascular territory might be involved?
So
in this?
definitely. So this is I have to just.
No, I'm just asking you,
Yeah, I
not
have an
not in this
image.
particular, but can we accurately map out that this is coming from LAD, this is coming
Definitely,
from?
sir, definitely.
Okay,
So
very good.
this would be somewhere in the L6 territory.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, that this is a posterior and posterolateral kind of an involvement, most likely should be LCX. So, okay.
So yeah, so what about prognostication? So candidates with myocardial scar, so that is scar percent of total LV volume greater than 14% and with more than 2 AHA segments of involvement of transmural late gadolinium scarring may benefit from ICD or implantable cardioverter defibrillator to prevent arrhythmias. So if we have this volume idea and the total segments involvement, so we can go about with the planning. And the nuclear medicine part will be taken up by my colleague, so we'll skip this. Now, how important is viability testing before going forward with a revascularization procedure? In patients showing areas of viability, revascularization results in reduction in the annual mortality by revascularizing. And patients without viability, there is no difference in the annual mortality between whether we.
So we are going to ask Saurabh this question, that many times when we do a PET scan for viability, we find that there are some islands of viable in a sea of scar tissue. You know, so how do we quantify? So Saurabh, I hope you're prepared to answer that question. Right. Good.
So just here, since we brought up this question, I'd like to say MR has an advantage here also. So those patchy islands, whether they are true or not, and even like microinfarcts, where we may not get regional wall motion abnormality. So even those area of specks of scar tissue will be picked up and as shown.
So between you and Saurabh, we should have a debate which one is better. But right now, we just want to learn more about your.
Okay.
So you have another 2 minutes because we want to listen to Saurabh also. Is it okay?
Yes, sir. And then one very common question: when to expect changes on MRI after treatment of a hibernating myocardium? So it's not like we did a revascularization procedure, beautifully done, and we'll be. So it will take a few months' time. Then we'll be able to appreciate those changes in the signal as well as wall motion. Okay, and there may be some cases when we do not get any gadolinium enhancement. So, okay, in this particular case where we are talking about myocardial viability or scar tissue, so we can be sure of there is no scarring in the tissue. Then it can add up some other information in some cases. Like there was this case where we had dilated cardiomyopathy with dilated end diastolic ventricular diameter and reduced ejection fraction. And we did this gadolinium enhancement study. And now, since now all of us are aware where to look for the scar tissue, how it looks, how bright it looks. So we, if each one of us will be very confident, pretty confident, there is no enhancing, no bright signal seen on within the myocardium. So and definitely we can appreciate in the mid diastole phase that the LV diameter is definitely more than 59 mm. So this study, besides reinforcing the findings of dilated cardiomyopathy, it also shows there is absence of myocardial scarring. And since patients with dilated cardiomyopathy with absent late gadolinium enhancement have better prognosis with lesser incidence of sudden cardiac deaths and ventricular arrhythmias, cardiologists can better counsel their patients. Okay, since there is no scarring, you have a fair chance of ending up in good thing.
That is why that 14% cutoff
was there.
So this is very important information. So I think let's wrap, because we will want to listen to Saurabh also. So now, yeah. So tell me now, what are the limitations of cardiac MR in whom we are, where we are unable to do this study? What are the challenges that you face? One is, what is your level of cutoff for creatinine?
So we normally it is 1.4, and it varies from lab to lab or institution to institution. So 1.4 to 1.5 is the creatinine cutoff.
And is there any way that we can lessen the occurrence of gadolinium-induced nephropathy or
Sir, usually we
mitigate that?
Yeah, in such cases, we like to pre-hydrate them, or if possible. Obviously, like if it already has poor LV dysfunction, we won't ask them to hydrate. And other could be like N-acetylcysteine is administered to reduce the risk of.
So the similar kind of strategies that we use for to reduce. Okay, that's one. What else?
And besides what the general contraindications for MR, whether he has a non-compatible device from cardiac pacemaker, but usually at our place, we are even doing with cardiac pacemakers, we are resetting that device for that particular period, and that within that interval period, we are able to achieve good results. And sir, the contraindications are general. What are there for?
Okay, last question. In a patient with who is undergoing chemotherapy, and you want to follow the LV function, how accurate is cardiac MR as compared to the other methods for assessing improvement or deterioration?
Okay. Sir, I would like to highlight one point here, especially if you are asking about LV function. So if we are only concerned with the LV function, we won't be doing contrast study. That is not required. That can be achieved without contrast study as well. This will reduce the cost, reduce the time of the study, as well as there is no risk of contrast-induced nephropathy and things.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Vivek. Very illuminating and very educative for people like us. Any questions or any queries can be put to Dr. Vivek before we move on to Dr. Saurabh for his presentation on nuclear cardiology and myocardial assessment. All right, so while the changeover is occurring, come please, Dr. Saurabh. Thank you very much, Dr. Vivek. Yes, so now over to you, Dr. Saurabh. Please introduce yourself. And
good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Saurabh from Nuclear Medicine Department. We'll be discussing about the basics of nuclear medicine, the modalities available. Then we'll shift over our discussion to the viability imaging.
Which is yours? This one, I think.
So the basic modalities of nuclear medicine imaging can be divided into two, which is called as SPECT, which is single photon emission tomography, and the PET. So the consideration here is the SPECT imaging is based on gamma photon, which is like commonly we know about thallium and technetium. So they release gamma photon, which is imaged using SPECT. And PET is based on positron emission. The radio tracer releases a positron, which is imaged using a PET scanner. So this is the basic difference. So now coming to the imaging part, among SPECT-CT imaging, we do the myocardial perfusion imaging, which is using thallium and technetium-based tracers. And in PET-CT, we can do perfusion imaging, then the metabolism imaging using FDG, and also the FDG and gallium dotanox scan can be used for inflammation imaging. So we'll see a few slides about that. Now coming to the basic principle of myocardial perfusion imaging. So here the concept is we are using IV administered radio tracer, which goes via the coronary flow to the myocyte, and then the myocyte takes up that tracer. So like the image which is shown is that thallium, which is going from the blood to the myocyte, it is taken up by sodium potassium pump into the cell because it behaves like a potassium. So, and also the technetium may be tracer or the tetrophosphine. It is also entered into the cell via the electrochemical gradient, and it gets trapped within the mitochondria. So basically it means that to go the tracer to go to the myocyte, the flow should be also normal, and also the myocyte should be viable. So these concepts we also consider in ischemia imaging and also in the viability imaging. The general indication for myocardial perfusion imaging is detection of coronary artery disease, obstructive coronary artery disease, and risk stratification post-MI, and risk stratification of chronic stable CAD patients, risk stratification of low risk and intermediate risk acute coronary syndrome patients, risk stratification before non-cardiac surgery, and also to evaluate the effectiveness of the therapeutic intervention, which can be drug therapy or the. So now the tracers, few points about the tracers. Among SPECT tracers, we have thallium, which was the initial used tracer. It is a cyclotron produced tracer, so we do not have this all the time available in the at the center. We have to order it. It comes from outside India, and the half-life is 73 hours. And technetium level tracers, these are generator-based tracers. We have the technetium generator available all the time in the institute. We just have to label it with different compounds like sestamib or tetraphosphine, and we are good to go with it.
We are generating these tracers in-house?
Yes. We have the technetium part available with the generator. We have to just mix it with the kit of the sestamib or the. So commonly we use sestamib and tetraphosphine both. Others we are not using it. Among PET tracers, we have rubidium-82, which is a generator-produced radiopharmaceutical, but it has half-life of 75 seconds. And this generator is very costly, in around 10 to 20 lakhs, and it has to be replaced every month. So that is why it is very less used. And other PET tracers are N13 ammonia and O15 water. So the negative point about that is the cyclotron has to be present inside the institute so that they can be used, because half-life is very less. So even though if the cyclotron is present, the procedure is very cumbersome to produce the tracers and adequately use them. So that is why the PET perfusion part is we are not doing, and also the institutes like AIIMS and PGI also are not doing the PET perfusion part. The perfusion is mainly done by the SPECT tracers only. And now only technetium-based tracers are used, and thallium is also fading out. So the perfusion imaging can be utilized for ischemia evaluation. Here there will be comparative evaluation of stress and rest images. So the stress part can be achieved by exercise or the pharmacological dobutamine stress, or the vasodilator can be used. And also the same perfusion imaging can be used for viability evaluation.
Between the three modalities of stress, is there anything to choose which is better of the three? Or
so any day exercise stress will be better. We can then we have the parameters from the stress we can also assess, but the flow which is achieved with the vasodilator, it is the maximum, which is around 4 to 5 times. So in that scenario, if we have to choose, and depending upon the cases also, then we can choose. But the stress parameters, the functional capacity of the patient, that can be assessed with the exercise part. And for the viability evaluation, so here there is no stress imaging is done, only the testing protocols will be used. So depending upon that, we'll see how the imaging protocols are used. So the imaging are analyzed visually. Then we have semi-quantitative parameters. We use basically same 17 segment model as it given in the AHA guidelines. And all these segments can be given scoring matter, like some difference score or some scoring is given, and then ischemia score can be calculated. But commonly we use just the segment part, and we mentioned that in the image. And for the quantitative part, the statistical software calculate the ischemia or the viability part. They basically use the statistics like more than 2.5 deviation away from the normal database. So they give the map, but usually we've seen they usually many a time overestimate or underestimate compared to the imaging. So there are few examples of the normal how the images are shown. So in above slides, it is a stress image, and the lower slides is rest image. So in ischemia, the comparative evaluation is done. So it is a
Can you point out what segments of the myocardium we are showing?
In this first section of the slides, these are the short axis view. So in here we can see the anterior wall, inferior wall,
Yes.
septal and the lateral wall.
Next
And these are in here we can see the septal wall, apex and the lateral wall. I have not shown the other slices in which inferior wall is shown completely. So this is an example of an ischemia scan in which stress images are showing perfusion defect in the apex and inferior wall, and the rest imaging, the defect is improving. So that means it's an ischemia scan. So if the defect is remaining persistent within the stress and the rest image, then that means there is no ischemia, but there is a scar tissue. But here also there is a fallacy. So the perfusion defect in the rest image, that completely doesn't mean it's a scar tissue, but that can be a hibernating hypoperfused tissue. But how we delineate that, then we will see in coming slides. So now coming to the viability assessment. So basic concept is same. The goal of viability assessment is to guide the therapeutic decision. We can because we know if the therapeutic intervention will improve the dysfunctional. If we improve the perfusion, the patient will improve the EF or the remodeling and the survival part. So this is the basic slide from the textbook, which is showing the concept of hibernating myocardium. That is the adaptive response because of the low perfusion. The contractile regional wall motion abnormality is there, but the concept is that the perfusion is less, but the cells are viable. So both these things can be assessed by the radionuclide imaging. So we'll see. So the perfusion defect will be assessed by the perfusion imaging, which can be either SPECT or the PET. So as initially I told about that presence of uptake in any segment will mean that the tissue is viable. But if perfusion defect is present in breast images, that doesn't mean it is a scar tissue. It could be a hypoperfused hibernating tissue. So then how to delineate it further? So in thallium, we use, if there is a stress defect, if there is a defect in the rest image, we follow it with a delayed image, which can be a 4-hour redistribution image. If there is an improvement, then that means it's a viable hibernating myocardium. But still 4 hours image cannot completely tell about all the hibernating tissue. Like some study have shown up to 20% defects which are irreversible at 3 to 4 hours can show reversibility at 24 hours. So if we give more time to redistribution, it can show more improvement. And also if we re-inject the tracer again before the rest image, redistribution image, then we can further improve the sensitivity. But then it comes to the radiation part, because if we are giving more radiation, the patient will be given the radiation part, so that they have to judge.
So this you are saying is with thallium.
Thallium. For maybe.
But you're saying we're not using thallium now.
So like for maybe, if there is a defect on the rest image in the maybe, then it can be followed up with a nitrate augmented imaging. So the concept is that the nitrate will augment the blood flow, so the tracer delivery to the hypoperfused segment will increase. But still, for viability, these were used before. Now we are using only PET. That is the gold standard. So among PET methods, the perfusion part is same, which was told earlier. And for metabolism, the glucose metabolism and the fatty acid metabolism can be traced. But since the fatty acid metabolism tracers are not easily available, so we'll stick to FDG part, which traces the glucose metabolism. So the concept of using FDG is that we can show, as we can see in the image, glucose and FDG have the same structure. Only the difference is second carbon has OH group in glucose and F18 in FDG. So the structure is same. So FDG enters into the cell by same GLUT transporter, and it enters the glycolytic pathway, and it's get phosphorylated by hexokinase enzyme, which is same for glucose and FDG. But the catch here is that FDG6-phosphate cannot go further into the glycolysis, so it gets trapped within the cell. So that is how we image the FDG in myocardium or any other imaging for oncology also. So, but as we know, for myocardium, fatty acid and glucose both are the substrate. So we have to create conditions in which the glucose is used more by the myocytes. So we use a glucose loading before the FDG, so that more glucose and FDG gets pushed into the cell, so that we can trace the metabolism. So for interpretation, perfusion images will be always captured first, then that area of the perfusion defect will be traced for the metabolism. The FDG images are not seen separately because they can show fallacious results also. So FDG uptake in the region of perfusion defect, which is commonly called as mismatch defect, it's indicative of the viable hibernating myocardium. So one of the example in which the perfusion defect is showing a large perfusion defect.
Why is it showing NH3 ammonia?
This I've taken from, this is the perfusion image, not from the institute.
So this could have, it would have been technician.
So just for the example, the perfusion defect on the rest images as showing the metabolism on complete metabolism. So that signifies it's a viable tissue.
The mismatch is better.
Mismatch is better. Complete mismatch is there. So in this example, so large perfusion defects in LAD territory, and which is not showing any metabolism. Yeah. So if there is some metabolism also that sir was saying the island of tissue, that we considered for the viability. Okay. We consider the whole territory wise. If there is any uptake there, we consider that as.
So we have found that many times, even if there is a single molecule which is metabolizing glucose, you are giving viability.
Yes.
But I think there are studies which are showing us that when we revascularize such, very little viable, maybe there's not so much improvement in
So
that.
like some study has quantified like more than 7%
Okay.
of hibernating myocardium. That
Do
can
you have those slides?
yes.
Yes, all right. So then we'll see.
So the results from the PET viability have shown there is linear correlation between the FDG uptake and the magnitude of the improvement. So there is no absolute cutoff for the. We take it as a continuous variable. In studies also, it is taken as a continuous variable only. And the scar size, which can be also estimated from the FDG. So that is also an independent predictor. The lesser the scar size, more the improvement. And which is given the information from the MRI. And in the FDG images, we get the viable myocardium. More the viable myocardium, more the improvement. So the literature about PET studies, there is almost sensitivity of up to 90% has been shown from the PET FDG PET studies to show the improvement in the regional function, and up to 83% showing the improvement in the global renal function. So there were initially trials also, randomized trials also, which are done. So in PAR-1 trial, which was positron emission tomography and recovery following the revascularization, there was good benefit from the PET tracer, but in the PAR-2 trial, there was no significant benefit which was shown. Maybe the different protocols were used. So the amount of scar was also independent predictor, and also they have shown the combination of PET and the clinical parameters show the more degree of improvement.
So in your experience, to what level of scar or what level of improvement in regional function would you say that this is now significant improvement in?
So we'll see about the territory. Even if there is a slightest of the uptake, we consider it as viable. So we give that territory will get benefited from the revascularization. So this was a comparative evaluation in which of the dobutamine stress echo, FDG PET-CT, and technetium-based tracer and the MRI, in which the FDG PET-CT was up to 92% sensitive for evaluating the revascularization benefit.
And specificity?
Specificity is less as compared to the dobutamine echo. Here the specificity was maximum for the dobutamine stress echo.
Right. So how do we interpret this? The interpretation of this is that PET is going to tell us that this is viable, but it is not going to predict that this is going to be clinically improve the. I think that is the way to interpret it.
Because muscle improvement we see in.
So what we did in our case was we did low dose dobutamine, and that was very specific that this is likely to improve. So this comes, because we again become. And how is cardiac MR in terms of sensitivity and specificity? Would you like to tell us?
We are again using low-dose dobutamine, so it can be correlated with the results with the stress echo we are getting. And in addition to that, we will be able to assess the myocardial. Being a cardiologist.
No. In terms of predictive, do you have any studies which tell us what is the sensitivity and specificity? Like this is now telling us PET and dobutamine and this thing. So I think that those studies,
like in this study also, the positive predictive values are almost same for all the investigations.
Yeah,
in the range
right.
of 80s and 90s.
Okay.
So the
I think it is less sensitive than PET. Still, cardiac MRI is less sensitive. Maybe
sensitivity is little higher, but all these studies have shown the overall results are almost equal for all the investigations, and you can choose depending upon the availability of the
clinical values.
But for actual diagnosis, since diagnostic accuracy is high for the PET, so they consider it as gold standard for viability. But depending upon the scenario and the expertise available and the imaging available, because PET will not be available all the time. So depending upon the availability, you can choose. There are some specific scenarios like this for patient with severe LV dysfunction in whom thinner myocardial wall is there, then the maybe cardiac MR will have better because the anatomical spatial resolution is better. In that case, it may give better information. So that's how we'll end these.
Okay. Thank you very much. So very, very informative and interesting talks. At least I learned a lot about PET and viability studies, about cardiac MR as well as this. So in our patient, I think what we followed was a reasonable strategy, that we were limited in terms of by the renal function.
there was a discussion like in contrast nephropathy, the FDG has no contraindication. That can be given easily.
Right.
But the sometimes we have difficulty in managing the. I was telling about the glucose. We have want to push in the glucose. In some patients of diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes, that protocol sometimes can be interfered. But with contrast, there is no contraindication.
So you are saying that we could have done,
Yes.
but I thought that your protocol always included perfusion and
But perfusion also can do there is no contraindication.
with FTG. So you could have done FTG, but FTG you could have done only viability, no? You could not have done perfusion.
Perfusion with the thallium or the system we can do.
Okay. All right. Okay. So that was good. So we could have chosen this also. But when I saw the echo, we found that the entire LV on echo was preserved. There was no scarring. And then we did the low dose dobutamine, which showed us that there is an improvement. So this is why we thought that that might be. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you so much. Would anyone like to make any comments or any? Dr. Amit Pendarkar is here. I can see Dr. Amit. Would you like to come in and tell us something about the case or about what is your take on this?
Sir, my take is that always this thing is we should always, before writing off a major that this is non-viable, we should always look for the viability assessment, because if we are able to revascularize a viable territory, because once we lose the myocardium, then it is always it affects the morbidity as well as mortality. So we should look for the opinion is that we should use all the modalities available with us. Unfortunately, in our institute, we have got both the things available. So I think viability assessment is an important aspect. And simply looking at the echo showing akinesia should not be sufficient to make us to write off the myocardium, especially in when the question is of LAD territory.
Sure. Definitely. Agreed. Anyone else has got any points? Yes, I can see Dr. Chadda. Good evening, sir. Good evening, Doctor. You're muted. Can you please unmute yourself? We'd like to.
Okay. See, sometimes after getting the results, we find the window is not good. So which are the patients who will have a poor window where the interpretation is not as good as the others will have?
The window in terms of you were asking for
Perfusion studies.
In perfusion studies. All right. Is there? Yeah. So when, for example, when we're imaging a patient, then we find that sometimes in patients with COPD or very bulky patients, we are unable to. I don't think that is a challenge at all for these perfusion studies. I don't think body habitus or any lung size or anything is any kind of challenge. Is it a challenge for cardiac MR anytime?
No, not MR. I'm talking about, you see, so many times you get reports of stress thallium being done, and the report is the window was not very good.
So initially the thallium was used. So thallium has relatively less energy as compared to technetium. So sometimes in inferior wall, we have attenuation because of the diaphragm. So in that case, dicey results can be there. But with technetium, so that problem is sorted out.
Okay, because I remember having read the report that the window is not very good. So I just remembered that which are the patients which will not have good window and where the results can be not very clear as you get in stress thallium or stress.
So I think with the newer radionuclide tracers like technetium, this is not a challenge.
Technetium. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, is Dr. Seema here? I can't. Dr. Seema was here some time ago. Okay. Any other queries or questions before we close? Please go ahead and make any closing remarks or any other things.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, apart from the normal FDG scans, like we have the PSMA for prostate, do we have any specific cardiac antigens also?
No, sir. So for the metabolism, it's the FDG part which is available, and that is also the protocol we use. Like for if we want to assess the metabolism, then we'll use the glucose loading protocol. But if we want to use FDG for the inflammation part, like for some time with the cases of sarcoidosis, cardiac sarcoidosis, then we use the high fat, low carbohydrate diet before the FDG injection. So that is the protocol, so that the normal FDG uptake from the normal myocardium is suppressed, and any uptake which is shown, that will be from the inflammatory cells. So that is how we use that is for as the inflammation imaging. And also the gallium protonox scan can be used for the inflammation imaging. So that here the principle is the somatostatin receptor expression in the chronic inflammatory cells. But that is also the interpreted in the context of the perfusion defect. If the site which is showing the perfusion defect, if it is showing increased protonok uptake, that suggests the inflammation part in that segment. So that is how we use.
Dr. Neeraj.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Prem here.
Dr. Prem, please put on your video, then we can identify you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, good evening. Good evening. Yes.
Good evening. How are you?
Yes.
I would just want to make a few comments. Rixi, going forward of the imaging of the viability of myocardium, it's going to be MR, which will be the future study of choice. But in the meantime, what we have right now is there are few limitations of MR, which currently we are facing. Number one, the patient needs to lie down. So a full good MR imaging takes at least 30 minutes or 45 minutes in its complete study. So for that much of a time, the patient needs to lie down. So these cardiac patients usually have difficulty lying down because they get breathless, they get claustrophobic, and they get difficulty lying still, number one. Number two, they need to hold their breath for a very good imaging that we require. So that holding the breath also is quite often challenging with the, you have a compromised cardiac function. So holding breath also becomes an issue there. Of course, there are advantages of non-radiation and MR being repeated as many times as you want. And contrast usually will be required in these patients. So kidney compromise would be a limitation. So there are gains and there are limitations for doing an MR. But I feel as technology and software improves, we will be able to take MR to a next level where it will be giving you a lot of answers on the viability of the myocardium.
Yeah, very practical points, Dr. Prem. Thank you for that. Very practical points, lying down flat, breath holding, and these can become significant challenges for cardiac patients, absolutely. So we need to take that into account also when we are prescribing a particular test for a patient. Thank you.
Can it be used to diagnose myocarditis if you're thinking of a inflammation like, there's no test to diagnose it? Suspect that things are...
Yeah. Dr. Vivek, would you like to answer that question?
So yes, definitely imaging for myocarditis is also one of the indications for cardiac MRI. And in that, again, we'll be having a late gadolinium enhancement kind of picture, but the pattern of involvement would be quite different from the ischemic kind of picture which we had seen today.
How sensitive or specific is it for?
Sir, it has a very high sensitivity, but specificity, I would say, since similar picture can be given by many scenarios, whether it is like through sarcoid or a myeloid depositions, or through other forms of myocarditis. So in like recent times, COVID-induced myocarditis. So we'll be able to pick up, there is involvement, transmural involvement, this is myocarditis, but this again has to be taken up into the clinical scenario, what actually are the differentials for our, so myocarditis will be established for sure, but about the differentials, we'll have to discuss with the clinical team whether what actually are.
So based upon the clinical suspicion, so MR, if you're strongly suspecting myocarditis, a patient comes with acutely breathless, a young lady, acutely breathless, say just after she's delivered, and you find that the LV is down and you don't know what is going on. Yes, I think definitely this can pinpoint the diagnosis. Is there any role for nuclear medicine in? So I think for inflammation, probably cardiac MR might be more sensitive there as compared to to a nuclear scan. All right. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful points. Wonderful points. And if there are no other discussion points, let me thank all my co-presenters, and starting with my young colleague, Dr. Amit Madan, for presenting the case, and Dr. Saurabh for presenting the nuclear medicine, and Dr. Vivek, thank you very much. And with this, we'll go to close this evening session. And thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to your presence in the next sessions also that we have. Now, Anjali has put a small feedback form, so you all please try to fill that up so that we can do things in a better fashion going ahead. Thank you very much.